Consider if you've ever watched the relatively new um, movie, I think it was 2002, Van Helsing. Vampires are the only thing that can kill werewolves, and werewolves are, oh, no, no, no. Werewolves are the only thing that can kill vampires, and, well, kill the head vampire or whatever. It's a little confusing. And then, in often stories, they'll just throw them together. I mean, consider Twilight, which is the jumping off point um, for this particular study. In Twilight, really the only two mythological creatures have are vampires and werewolves. Why they're put together, do I really think it's from rabies? Have I ever heard anyone say, well, both, probably derived from rabies, because, of course, with werewolves, a person having rabies from a dog, they get bit by a dog, and then they suddenly seem to have the mind of a dog. It seems like a pretty logical thing to think that the person's now turned into a dog in some non-physical sense, which, of course, gets transferred to physical, in a physical sense as well over the years in legend. But I don't really know if that's why they're so closely put together. I haven't been able to find any good reliable evidence as to why the two are put together. But that's my speculation. I think it's probably because both of them might have been related to rabies. But returning to the garlic and the sunlight and the Dracula and vampires with rabies. So yes, I think the explanation that rabies explains most of this is interesting. And the fact that rabies is attributed to vampirism is, I think, a very important thing to consider in the psychology of vampires and why we as humans created them. You'll hear almost everyone say monsters are created because, we're afraid of the dark and we need something to explain the unknown and we need a way to express our fears. And I believe that's completely true. But I believe that looking at the way rabies is tied to vampirism, it probably makes sense to say that not only are we explaining the unknown and expressing our fears, but we are trying to explain away the unknown in sense of things that we see. It's the same reason that people create most myths. People create the myths of why the sun rises and why the moon travels across the sky. And in Norse and Greek legends, this is very similar. You've got a chariot in which the sun is being pulled, and it made sense. And that kind of explained the heavenly movements. And of course, as time went on, and you had Christianity become very prevalent, then you had these perfect crystalline spheres of Aristotle that was later through Christian philosophy propagated, and these embodied the perfectness of heaven. And God created these spheres, and of course Dante takes this in his Paradiso to the next level, saying these are actually heaven. Each of these spheres is a different sphere of heaven. So I think rabies is simply the same thing. It's not as most people say. Vampires are being expressed by the fact that we don't know what's in the dark and we're afraid of the dark. But also by the fact that we can see something, and without science, we can't really explain it. So, vampires and werewolves. You see someone going crazy after being bitten by a wolf, and it makes sense to think that something magical is going on, especially in a community where magic is an everyday occurrence. So I think this is interesting. Instead of looking at vampires from the perspective of our fear of what we cannot see, I think in some ways it is our fear of what we can see. But then, of course, you complicate it by bringing in, over the years, and even in the original times, you bring in darkness. You bring in the sense of these things are happening in a situation in total dark, in which you cannot really see what's going on. Um, so I think it's both. But I think the fact that it is explaining something that we just do not have an explanation for at the time, but we know some facts about. It's not completely unknown. I think this is very important because I think it says something about humans which is fundamental. I think a lot of the monster legends we create are originated from external fear and not just internal fears. There are definitely internal fears, and I think we reflect them in our elaboration of myth, but I think a lot of times it's actually an external catalyst um, that sets off this reaction of combining internal and external. So this is just, of course, what I think from my studies, but this is what I've come up with, and I really believe it's true. So moving on back to the book, back to Eric Nussum's book. So he goes to Transylvania. He goes on this vampire tour. He meets a bunch of goths. He meets a bunch of very interesting people. He dances in Dracula's castle. Well, it's not really Dracula's castle. It was actually the castle they used in the movie. Anyways, it's turned into a hotel. They eat really bad food. He gets mosquito bites that become infected, and he's afraid his thumb's going to fall off. Lots of interesting things. It makes me never want to go to Transylvania, especially on a vampire tour. But anyways, interesting. Then he comes back, and he's still not done doing interesting things. This, I think, was probably the most interesting part of the book. He is on a quest to watch every single vampire movie ever made. I pity him that he had to watch every single vampire movie ever made, because there are a lot of them. I think at the time that he was writing, he could find 300, and he was still finding more. There's everything from, the classics, Interview with a Vampire, Count Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula, to porn vampire films, and then, of course, to really, really, really bad, the Six Wives of Dracula and Night of the Vampire's Child, and just some really horrible movies. So anyways, he's on a quest, and how does he do this? Well, he orders the movies through Netflix, of course, because Netflix is wonderful. So he's ordering the movies through Netflix, and he sets up a separate account just for his vampire movies to kind of try to keep his life separate from his vampire quest, which, completely makes sense to me. So he has this separate vampire account, and he's looking at the recommendations one day, because Netflix, if you've never used it, Netflix gives you recommendations based on what you have already watched and what you like. So the recommendations that Netflix gives him are The Goonies and the 4th season of Friends. He's watched at this point 98 vampire movies, and only 98 vampire movies on that account, and there's The Goonies and Friends. Now, if no one has ever watched The Goonies, it's a pretty fun movie to watch. It's about teenagers who go looking for treasure in this cave. So, anyways, it's a good movie. And then Friends, I've never watched, but I understand it's a kind of sitcom. But neither of them have anything to do with vampires, kind of at all. So, intrigued by why Netflix's algorithm was so determined that he would like The Goonies and the 4th season of Friends, not the 1st, the 2nd, or the 3rd, or the rest of them. I think they had 7 or 8. Anyways, he calls the owner of, well, not the owner, the person who designed the Netflix recommendation system. So this man, Neil Hunt, is the chief product officer at Netflix. So he talks on the phone with this guy and says, why is it giving me these recommendations? How does your system recommend movies? And Neil Hunt from Netflix says it's based on how much a person who likes one movie likes another movie. So this is a quote from the book. He explained that Netflix's recommendation system was solely based on a statistical probability. If you like movie A, you'll probably like movie B. Netflix takes in data from user ratings of the movies the user has seen, then extrapolates the findings based on the results from their 3 million other users, and comes up with a prediction of what movies you might like. They run the results through an accuracy matrix, whatever the hell that is, and boom, you have recommendations based on your previous ratings. This just made me more flummoxed. I wanted to know what these recommendations mean. I immediately rented both Wayne's World and The Outlaw Jones Wales, and can say with certainty that neither contained any vampire subplots or themes whatsoever. I'm just taking a side. I forgot those were the other two movies that it recommended besides The Goonies and The Four Seasons Friends. So if the recommended if the recommendation doesn't say anything about the movies themselves, what does it say about the people who rent them? In other words, if someone loved Vampire Sisters and also loved Wayne's World, does his or her multi-affection reveal anything about them as a person? This is the end of the quote. So that's very interesting. And I rewatched The Goonies, and I tried to get friends, but I haven't been able to get friends yet. And in terms of Wayne's World and The Outlaw Josie Wiles, I haven't watched either of those. But I was about as flummoxed as him. I have absolutely no idea what the connection is. But it's very fascinating. I can kind of understand in something like Friends, because I have friends who have watched Friends, and I can kind of understand if you liked Friends, then you might also like movies like Twilight, which were very popular. Some of my friends like both of them quite a bit. So that makes sense. But I don't think he's watched Twilight. He never said he did. I don't think it was out when he was writing this book. So I am not quite sure at all. But it's an interesting thing to look at. It's very perplexing. But what is even more fascinating is something that came up in the looking at movies after a presidential election, and this is what Neil Hunt says. However, we do sometimes aggregate information, Neil shared. When you look at it that way, we've often found geography shows distinct tendencies. For example, you could have predicted the 2004 presidential election, red states and blue states, based solely on the reaction users had to the Passion of the Christ. In states where the Passion of the Christ received high ratings, they voted red. In states that voted blue, they didn't like it as much. Neil said the example holds up state by state across the entire electoral map. Of course, they didn't notice this until after the election, but it's still a pretty amazing match. If anything, Neil's Mel Gibson George Bush correlation just got me more amped. There had to be some meaning in this vampire Goonies business somewhere. End quote. So I think that's fascinating. I mean, it's definitely not as unusual to me as why you like the Goonies and Friends and also vampires, because there you could kind of say that George Bush is definitely a conservative, and Mel Gibson's movie is playing to conservatives. Or it's designed for conservatives, so I can kind of see the correlation there. And of course, there's a whole bunch of conservatives who aren't Christian, um, and who still voted for George Bush. But I can see that there's some correlation here. But the Goonies and vampires and the Friends and the Outlaw Josie Wiles? No, I can't see it. There must be. I agree. I agree with the author. There absolutely must be some sort of correlation. There must be something that these people share. But as I'm not a huge friend, a huge fan of any of those movies, I can't personally say I know, and watching them, I can't completely see what it is. But hopefully someday someone will figure out and really study this connection. It's particularly fascinating. So, anyways, um, that's all I'm going to talk about in this little segment. I hope you've had fun. I tried to provide as much interesting information as I can. So, see you next time. Bye.